Okie dokie. So before I start with my usual analogies and metaphors, I just would like to introduce myself and the panel first, so at least give you guys a minute each to talk. So I'm Rob from STF. I'm on the partnership side, taking care of what we call regulated assets, which is mostly what we also call RWAs, so securities, commodities, and payment assets like stablecoins, tokenized deposits, CBDCs, and everything between the mix. And the topic of our conversation here, I think it's a very near and dear conversation for anyone talking about RWA, which is, well, we have a bunch of them. We also have many blockchains. So how do we sort out interoperability? How do we keep, as Jed said, the user experience convenient and practical, right? So before I keep going, I'll do the courtesy here to go through introductions from further to closer. So Guy, can you please start?
Yes. Hey, everyone. My name is Guy Hadar. I'm VP Payments at Fireblocks. For those of you who are not familiar with Fireblocks, Fireblocks is the go-to infrastructure for any company that wants to basically deal with digital assets and build on top of digital assets. So we're servicing companies from banks, exchanges, retail fintech, payment companies, and more. Before Fireblocks, I co-founded a stablecoin payment company that helped basically piece to go into the world of payments on-chain. And we were acquired by Fireblocks about 3 years ago. And today, myself and my partners and team, we're leading everything related to payments, serving almost 180 payment companies as part of Fireblocks. So nice meeting you all.
Marco?
Hey, everyone. Marco. I'm the head of revenue at Bridge. Bridge is an API platform that enables payments over stablecoins. Before Bridge, I was the chief business officer at Brex, which is a global corporate card. And before that, I was responsible for payments at Uber. So acquiring disbursements and basically global money movement around the world for many years. And so excited to be diving into interoperability on-chain.
Amy?
Great, thank you. My name's Amy Fisher, and I lead strategic partnerships for fintech and crypto at a company called Plaid. Plaid is a connectivity company that originated connecting US bank accounts to fintech apps that you know and love, like Venmo. Since then, has become a pillar in onboarding, identity verification, and fraud prevention. We deal with powering some of the biggest exchanges in the ecosystem, as well as user onboarding. And you could think of the connectivity to fiat being really central to Plaid's core business. Prior to this, I was leading strategic partnerships at a company called R3 with the Corda platform. Daniela and I were on many panels back then when I think there were only 3, 4, or 5 chains. We've been talking about interoperability for quite a long time. And prior to that, I was a director at FTI Consulting, where, believe it or not, I was told that there was not enough blockchain fraud, disputes, or litigation to justify opening up a new practice. So things have really changed in the past 7 or 8 years.
Awesome. Daniela?
Daniela Barbosa. I'm the executive director of the Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust umbrella. This is an umbrella of projects, of blockchain and digital identity projects. The Linux Foundation for the last 20 years has been the home for what I would call the most important open source projects, obviously the Linux kernel itself, but also in all industries and transformative industries, including cloud computing, AI. And since 2015, the community really understood that blockchain and digital identity needed to not only be open source that's openly governed under a foundation like the Linux Foundation. So a lot of the things that we are talking about today, the community has for years, even when it was only a few blockchains, understood that long-term topics like interoperability were going to be important, and there's different ways to do it. But more importantly, that open source is the key to getting this right.
Awesome. No, I think that sets a bit of the stage of what we want to talk. So before jumping into the questions here, I think earlier today, Tori from our product team was hosting a great panel about best practices for founders launching new products. And she talked a lot about metaphors as a way to communicate the idea of your product more than going to the technical specs right away. So there is a metaphor I used to use a couple of years ago when explaining payments on blockchain, which is when you look at the current payment systems, you think as a highway, that every country built its own highway. Some highways operate from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Some of them only allow one kind of car. And we can keep on building this analogy considering, the existing rails each country has. And I think the interesting thing about blockchain, and even before it gets regulated, is that the innovators were kind of building this parallel highway which knew no borders, knew no open and ending time of day. It's 24/7, and basically trying to allow any cars to drive in that highway for cheap and fast, and so the analogy goes. That analogy is cool when you start comparing it with like ACH and wire transfers and other rails that you have on the TradFi system. But now maybe blockchain is so successful that, to Amy's point, when she was at R3 and there were like 4 or 5 chains or 4 or 5 highways, now we have almost hundreds of highways out there on the blockchain space. And the convenience is actually not that much anymore, because which highway am I using? And they don't accept all the same cars, or the same model of cars now driving in multiple highways. So anyways, enough with this metaphor, but I think you kind of get the spirit here, where we have a lot of potential on DLT and blockchain from a cross-border convenience and cost perspective. But I think we're kind of victim of our own success, in the sense that there's now maybe too many highways, and there are people building highways on top of highways called layer 2 highways. So that is being complex on its own, right? So just a quick show of hands here, because I did some research. Do you guys think that we have 10 to 30 layer 1s out there, 30 to 80, or above 80? So 0 it's not, but let's say 10 to 30 layer 1s. Show of hands. Okay, everyone think it's more than 30. Between 30 and 80 layer 1s. Okay, we see a couple of hands. Maybe this has given the answer itself, but above 80 layer 1s. Yep, that's it. So I could keep going, but then it will be kind of a survey event. But we have 140 mainnet layer 1s. There are a bunch on testnet, 140 mainnet layer 1s. And I asked the AIs to double check that question. From those 140 mainnet L1s, 15 already have more than $100 million in TVL. There's over 30 L2s and 6 L2s that have over $100 million in TVL. So just looking at L2s and L1s together, you go to roughly 100 chains, right? That are, having actually 40 on over 100 million, but more than 100 chains in total. And actually the confusion keeps on going when you think about stablecoins, because there are 180 mainnet stablecoins, and then if you cut by supply, there's more than 70, and most of them US and Euro, with more than $1 million in supply. So you have a bunch of highways, a bunch of cars, and we hopefully want to drive on a convenient fashion. So I hope this was a useful kickoff analogy, and let's try to get some ideas on how to work with that reality. So I think the first question here would be how, and I'll kind of throw to the panelists here, how do you see the reconciliation of those realities? And if there is an angle to reconcile this innovation and convenience of blockchain with the fact that it's spreading wider and wider in multiple layer 1s, layer 2s, and assets? Any volunteer?
Well, I'll add that there's also this world of permissioned blockchain ecosystems that's probably 100,000x.
So the gated highways, only the cars I allow get in.
But still, and what we're seeing more and more is enterprises actually wanting to move from the public to the private. So interoperability into legacy systems is also a big thing. We've always been at the Linux Foundation, formerly known as Hyperledger. We've always been of the opinion that it was going to be a multi-chain world. I don't think anyone came into the industry thinking otherwise. We didn't think it was going to get to this number and continue to grow. I do personally feel that there will be consolidation. There has to be some consolidation, like in all marketplaces there's consolidation. But ultimately, it's figuring out these ecosystems do need to interact and bring value to each other and move value around. And how do you go about doing that? And right now, if you look at the market, there's also not just one way to do interoperability. There's going to be multiple ways and multiple approaches in how you do interoperability between chains. And I think the market has to innovate, because what we know today about how public blockchains are being used and permission blockchains are being used is very different than in 2015 and 2017.
Yep. Yeah, and I think a follow-up to that question is, we're certainly going to have to sort out ways to connect those, highways, if I stick to this analogy, so the interoperability and the multi-chain. But there's also the concern if it's going to be every chain for every asset, or it's going to be something that is going to be more a use case specific, right? So I think the permission angle kind of already answered that question, because I think the ones looking for permission solutions have a very probably specific use case on regulated assets, but would also kind of want to grab your thoughts on looking at the future. Do you see still this kind of multi-chain, multi-asset, multi-use case, or potentially a world where the narrowness is going to be, this is for cars, this is for trucks, this is for RVs, or, yeah?
I can try to take it. I actually going to take the stance that I'm going to talk about the present, maybe not the future. So when we're seeing like payment companies doing all kind of things, like either cross-border or pay-ins or payouts, they actually don't necessarily, at this point of time, care about moving from that chain to the other chain. It's more about like, can I even interact with the local fiat payment system into stablecoins, and then on the other side of the flow, can I get out of stablecoin into fiat and then do local payout in fiat, for example? Because the issues they're facing, or why are they using stablecoin? They're using it to bypass correspondent banking mostly, right? If you're thinking about like local payments or local RTGS systems, they're working just fine. And the issue becomes, or the problem becomes, when you're doing cross-border. That's why they're using stablecoins. But in most flows, you're going to start, we're not living in only on-chain kind of world. So every flow will start either with fiat, and then you'll move to stable, and then fiat, or maybe it will just be fiat stable, or maybe vice versa, but there is fiat somewhere there. And the issue there is to have this on and off ramps that can provide deep enough liquidity, good enough fee structure, and also from a technical perspective, they need to be able to support that, right? We see some on-chain, some on-ramps in different regions that for some reason they won't support USDC over Stellar, right? For some reason, from technical perspective. So we need to make sure that from a technical perspective, it's doable, that it makes sense from a fee perspective, and you have deep enough liquidity. And also, they need to be able to connect to fiat, local fiat rails, because if you need to fund your account through SWIFT, the entire purpose of the cross-border is kind of like makes no sense, right? So you need to be able, for example, if I'm in Colombia, I need to be able to send money locally in the local currency, then convert it, then start a flow. So I think these are the major issues or challenges that we need to solve for in order to make payments on-chain more, widely spread.
Yeah. And Marco, Amy, I think connecting the dots here, to a certain extent, your platforms, and Guy, I think yours as well, might be at least partially the solution to abstract that complexity to the end user, right? Because you would still have multiple chains. I'll stop with the highway analogy. So you have multiple chains, you'll have multiple stable coins, but ultimately they want to go from fiat to stable coin and maybe trade something on DeFi and go back. So do you guys expect, or is there something you would like to see out there to make your life, to enable this end user experience of abstraction and simplicity? So just give you an example. We hear about the BIS standards, or we hear about GL1, or we hear about layer 0. There are like other potential standardization bodies, but assuming, I think none have actually kind of got the traction. Is that something or something else that could help your life building the product to the end user?
Yeah, I think thinking back to the earlier days of the blockchain ecosystem, a way that folks would solve for the interoperability challenge was through APIs. We still see that today. And I think what Bridge represents, if I may speak for you, is more sophisticated APIs to improve the onboarding for users. And I think where we were 5 years ago, 10 years ago to where we are now, as the ecosystem has created a demand for better onboarding, better liquidity, and a better user experience. Ultimately, using that network will help the entire ecosystem grow, regardless of the number of chains, or stablecoins for that matter.
But then you were talking about APIs, right?
APIs.
Okay, so the way you expose those services to you guys, right? So assuming that someone will do that. But is there some concern about the standardization on how those services are exposed to you? Do you need to learn case by case, rule by rule? Because at this point, even from an asset perspective, you don't have any standardization. You have something on the stablecoin side, on the security side is still fairly complex. So do you see even something coming out of Hyperledger? Like, is there some standardization that you would look forward to?
It's extremely challenging, and I can speak to a couple of the early working groups working closely with the Linux Foundation, as well as some of the open finance and open banking standardization that we see with FDX, that we see within the upcoming Dodd-Frank 1033 rule. And it's very challenging to get standards unless they're mandated across the board from the top down. Standardization from the bottom up is very challenging. A lot of the same people are in the same working groups. They're very smart people working on it, but it's almost as if you need the top down permissioning to be able to get there as the accepted standard. I think standardization would help, but this has been going on for decades in terms of the precursors to digital finance. I don't know if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think Bridge is what happened while we were waiting for standardization, which is, in the beginning, Bridge's focus was actually more on stablecoin issuance, but where the demand was from developers was converting from one chain or sometimes one stablecoin to another. And it turns out it's pretty hard to do, to create the infrastructure and the compliance and the liquidity management to go across all that. And it has become a core part of the business to simplify it and make it accessible via an API so that developers and end customers don't need to be bothered with that as much as they can just abstract away and easily move their digital assets across these boundaries. And so, yeah, for the near term, the lack of standardization is kind of our business opportunity. But I think standardization obviously would be welcome as we go forward.
Yeah. And I think there's a tricky component there because I agree that standardization bottom up is really tricky. But then a standardization top-down, especially in our world of blockchain, kind of goes against with everything we believe in, right? And actually, there's no authority globally that, the United Nations is not going to regulate stablecoins. So in that sense, it's tricky to get there. So what we've been seeing is some consortiums or coalitions, right? Or even I think there's the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance that just published a very detailed paper on how to interoperate assets that are EVM and non-EVM, right? So any experience on your sides interacting with those consortiums and coalitions, and to your point, Daniela, you're thinking about a convergence, which I actually hope happens, because if it keeps on opening, we are actually not delivering the promise. Do you think also on this kind of standard bodies and coalitions, there are going to be some sort of convergence? Is it possible?
Yeah, I do think so. In order for these technologies to be production level, global financial infrastructure, there has to be. You always have the chicken or the egg issue, is you can't develop standards if the technology is not ready to develop the standards, because then you're constantly having to redo them. And there's really smart people working in some of these consortiums that are thinking, logistically, how do they go about doing it? And even the IETF, which is a technical standards body, has a very aggressive goal of getting standard specs out as well. So I think that the work is certainly happening. But what happens is, and the approach that at the Linux Foundation we do with Hyperledger Cacti is, back to the exponential. Like, if every time you have to build a plugin to go connect this chain to that chain, and then go connect Stellar to Bezu, and go connect Stellar to something else, it gets really complicated for the developers and the technical debt that long-term you have to live with.
Yep.
So our approach, and has been for a while, the community has come together, it's called Hyperledger Cacti, is really an SDK of SDKs. So we recently announced a connector from Stellar to Cacti. And that connector now from Stellar can go into Bezu, for example, or even Hyperledger Fabric, or Polygon, or others, right? So the connector is only built once, and one of your partners, Cheesecake Labs, actually did a fantastic presentation earlier on this, and the connector is built once and reusable throughout. So that's the approaches that I think, because we cannot anticipate where the market is going to go, that we need to build out, right, is these levels of connectivity that is easily expandable without breaking the bank.
But in that case, you guys are, again, providing the ecosystem for those interoperability to exist, but do you think that the Cacti could become, maybe not the single one, but one of the main standards for folks to go between one public chain to another? Do they need to hop through Bezu to get to, let's say it's Stellar and Ethereum, can they use Cacti to go directly, or they got to hop to Hyperledger?
Yeah, it's about creating those, those connectors directly to the different chains as well.
Gotcha. So in this case, it's actually building the connector itself, right, as this SDK. Gotcha. I think the other two interoperability situations that we see now, in the sense of like the good being the enemy of the great or the perfect, is that the asset issuers themselves are becoming an interoperability layer, right? Because we have a bunch of stablecoins, but in the end, it's 3-4 that are succeeding out there. So we have Circle and Tether, as far as I know, working as kind of an interoperability layer between multiple chains, but restricted to their own assets, right? And then we have other players like Axelar and Wormhole, then doing this thing which is a little bit more multi-asset, but maybe not as multi-chain, because it's very complicated for them to build those very secure interoperabilities between chains. So also opening broader to the floor here, between those solutions, any of those are being more used on your end, either the issuer interoperability or the third-party bridge interoperability that helps you guys build your product?
I mean, I can say from the bridge perspective, we see many, I guess, multiple dozens of layer ones and layer twos. We're going to see orders of magnitude more stablecoins when you get to the assets level. And we just see that coming from developers who want a more programmatic experience to create not just a stablecoin store of value, but like almost like a loyalty experience within their application layer. And the interoperability for that is riding on the layer one. And so it sort of comes baked in, but we expect to see a huge diversity in stablecoins.
And how do you choose which one to adopt in this case? Is it because
as a developer?
Yeah.
Interesting question. And I think that the answer varies a lot per developer. Sometimes it's there's like a geographic preference, maybe based on the developer engagement that has come before in the years leading up to that decision. Sometimes it's a technology-based decision. Sometimes it's an economics and incentives-based decision. Maybe it's even down to like the relationships among the developer community and the foundation teams. I can't say that there's like a singular answer that we've seen on that.
But then interoperability not necessarily being the key driver for adoption of a single asset versus another one from your client base perspective, right?
Yeah, not to date.
Guy, you guys support a bunch of assets, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I can provide my perspective. So at Fireblocks, we support all blockchains, all currencies, and what I see for the payments flows, we see that stablecoin, for example, it's very regional based. So, for example, like obviously USDC is more used in Western countries because there is more trust in the system. Because eventually it's USD that sits in some bank account, right? And if the regulator wants to freeze those funds, they can freeze those funds, right? They can instruct Circle to do that. On the other way, you have USDT more adopted in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa, for example, because it's like mirroring of it. It's the opposite, right? They're trusting more their own system. Although there are some conversation, is it actually one-to-one in USDT? Yes, no, I don't know. That's what people say. So, but it's about trust of the system. And also we're seeing it that in some areas or some use cases, in Africa, for example, they like USDC and USDT because it's easier to get in Africa, for example, stablecoin liquidity versus the actual USD or euro, for example, because of capital restriction. So it really depends on the use case, and it really depends, but it mostly depends, I think, on the trust of the system.
Gotcha. No, that I think resonates with what we experience as well at Stellar. And I think we're kind of narrowing to some, I wouldn't say conclusions, but at least some, I think, shared point of view. I think one is we're not seeing a silver bullet anytime soon from an interoperability perspective, right? We're not going to have I think this name has been already taken, but a layer 0, whatever that means, right? We're also then seeing some happy outcomes on the kind of self-organic association, so groups of companies getting together and trying to either self-regulate, I don't think regulation is a good word, but self-standardize. But I think maybe as usually the innovators and the developers come first, and then we're seeing multiple solutions bridging assets and bridging chains among each other to allow that to become a reality. So I think with that still fairly dispersed scenario ahead of us, are you guys comfortable trying to kind of think what the short-term future would look like from an interoperability perspective? Do we think it's more of the same, or there might be something new coming around the corner that would make you happy, us happy from a developer perspective or product design perspective?
I'm happy to take a first shot at this one. So I think from a benchmark perspective, something that will be extremely helpful to the ecosystem. The last I checked, stablecoin usage, 80 to 90% of that is speculation and trading. Once we start to see more and more real-world use case adoption of the many powers of stablecoins, that will be a determining factor on which stablecoins will be adopted the most widely globally and across the board. I think that is the biggest challenge facing stablecoins as a whole, and ultimately the ecosystem as a whole. There's been so much focus on crypto and on currencies and on speculation, and frankly, it's what regulators are concerned about. Once we can get towards the real world use cases, beyond the speculation and trading, we will see a marked difference in adoption, on consolidation, and moving the ecosystem forward.
I think this is a great insight. So just thinking what you've said, if 80 to 90% of the stablecoin usage is trading, then interoperability is not that relevant to the end user, because the guys trading already know how to pick their chain, and they're also going to deploy this asset on Uniswap somewhere or
arbitrage against the interoperability as
Yep.
well, right?
Or doing it on a centralized exchange, and then on the centralized exchange, the layer 1 is abstracted. You don't know where that stable coin is sitting. You hope it sits somewhere, but it's not clear to you. So I think that's a good takeaway. As like on Stellar, we try to focus on the real world use cases. And as you build more real world use cases, then probably the interoperability becomes more important, because part of the flow would probably be optimum at Stellar, part of the flow is optimum at another chain, and we need to make sure that connection is really polished, right?
Yeah, I think the way I look at it, it's right. Once everything will be on chain only, when you have this closed loop of businesses accepting stablecoin as a payment method, then they're storing it, then they're paying with it, and then you have this closed loop, everything is on chain. Like having all these blockchains talking to each other is really, really important. This is what will happen in the future. I don't know when. Today, when we're still living in this fiat world, basically, the importance is about what we just discussed, like liquidity, cost, access. But I think we're getting there. We're seeing more and more in businesses now. Stripe yesterday talked about it, like accepting payments, holding it as a business, pay out with it. Then we'll have this closed loop. Then, the blockchains talking to each other will be really, really, really important.
Cool. I think we have Anybody wants
Yeah,
to
I
add
just
to
want
that?
to add one thing, because
Sure.
you talked a bit about the regulators before, and I think they're actually ahead of the game on this. Like, if you look at some of the bigger projects worldwide, especially in Asia Pacific, around, you mentioned Global Layer 1, and there's a Project Agora and Project Guardian. These are all, regulators working with the private sector, because all the private sector banks are in there, thinking and trying to construct a way to move money around, knowing specifically with things like the central bank digital currencies. We had a panel before on the DREX. How do these sovereign countries move digital money, interoperate, if each central bank digital currency is using a different DLT in a different platform and has different smart contracts and has different ways. So I think interoperability as a global view from a regulator's perspective, there's this concept now that the BIS is out there talking about the fin internet. It's my 2024 word, the fin internet. But the concept is what really a global market needs, right? Everybody goes onto the same internet. Right? We don't go on different internets. We might use different providers to access the internet, right? And we have different clients that access the internet, but overall, we're all on the same internet as well. So I think that the regulators will get to a point where maybe some standards need to be agreed upon globally.
Yeah, and you remind me of something that sometimes we talk about SWIFT in not the most positive way in our industry, but we also got to give credit that SWIFT and MasterCard are two examples that I know are working with interoperability, and then it goes beyond, Guy, to your point, not only between blockchains, but also between the fiat world and blockchains, right? So I think the SWIFT connector, I think the third pilot is coming up, and also MasterCard has the multi-token network as a first pilot as well. So I think kind of the conclusion here is there's a lot of people doing a lot of things. I think we need to narrow it down and get those kind of subgroups to collaborate and potentially do something even more broader reaching than creating new interoperability standards. And judging by the time, I don't know if we have the technology and the ability to hold questions, and if we have interest of asking questions. But if we do, happy to. Do we? The Slido thing is running? I don't think so.
I think we might have a live question.
Yeah, we can have analogic questions.
There you go.
Old school. This question is for Marco, because I think you mentioned that there's going to be use of stable coins by brands for loyalty programs. Would you mind expanding on that a little bit more and maybe give some examples if there are any brands doing that at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, this is just kind of my personal forecast of the future, so take it or leave it. But think about like the Starbucks app, for example. You top up a balance, and there's some financial engineering where the Starbucks cost of acceptance is lower, but there's an end user loyalty experience associated with it where you get some sort of a reward for repeat visits. And that is built by like a 50-person team within Starbucks that specializes in front-end design and back-end financial products and financial services. That all can be easily built on chain with essentially like a custom stablecoin that would be like a Starbucks branded stablecoin. It doesn't have to be a stablecoin that's used for payments and acceptance like outside of the merchant's point of sale. It doesn't need to be like available for exchange at Coinbase. It's simply like an expression of the loyalty program, and it does happen to store some value, like today's prepaid wallets do, or even gift cards. Just think about like when you go to the Tesco or Safeway, and there's that gift card mall with like 50 different brands that sell a prepaid stored value. That could be easily built on chain. And of course, then there's the benefit that today only Circle and Tether experience, which is the interest on the reserves. And so there's a lot of benefit to be gained by merchants. And it's easier to build than it ever has been. So I'm personally just a big fan of a future and where that's going on.
I would add to that. I think about that future like the future of an email address, except it's a programmable digital wallet with no spam folder. There are a lot of brands that have become early adopters, but what you can really think about from it is the change of how value is exchanged and creating new concepts of free-flowing cash or free-flowing exchange of value using this type of structure on chain, which is really exciting. I think it will take a long time to get there, but being a partnerships person from a partnerships perspective, it's very exciting to think about.
I think we have time for one more question. I think there's a mic coming.
Hello. Can we imagine a big AI box doing the 1,000 in, 1,000 out?
Sorry, say that again?
Yeah, big artificial intelligence box, coding,
Yep.
basically whatever comes in, comes out, whatever you want.
Did you guys get the question? Or an AI
What's the
box?
question?
Yeah,
I can hear.
AI to code.
Like,
Oh, using AI to code.
oh, gotcha. Using AI to bridge? Yeah.
Certainly there's an opportunity.
Yeah, I think like for us to build the code of a bridge, you can use AI, but then we go to the tricky point that we need to audit it, fail, test, and all that thing. So I think it's part of the solution. Yep. Yeah, using AI to audit the AI might be a bit tricky, but I get your point.
Need a blockchain for that.
Exactly.
I think AI can also drive down the costs, some of the big cost centers that businesses see to adopt it. So.
Okay, so I need to wrap up because this thing is blinking, but happy to take questions outside. And I was told to give the DJ a cue to play the music, so that's the cue. Thank you.